Building a new system and want to make every pound go as far as it can? Fancy affordably experimenting with micro ATX? Just on the lookout for a cheap case with striking visuals? Well, for your consideration, today we present the Cooler Master MasterBox Q300L PC chassis. Hi, this is Tim from Vortex once again, giving you our take on the Q300L. Arguably the entry point for Cooler Master's MasterBox range. At CES 2018, Cooler Master announced a broad refresh of the MasterBox line, and the Q300L was one of over half a dozen new and updated designs to suit many different budgets and aesthetic preferences. By design, this case in particular meets a very aggressive price point, a touch under £40 in the UK, including VAT, or $40 excluding taxes in the US. But be aware that its micro ATX size reduces motherboard compatibility. Even with no other considerations to be made, such as build quality or quality of life features, this alone would make it a considered purchase. Nonetheless, if you're in a tight spot with your budget and looking to assemble an MATX system, the Q300L should make the long list of options. The first thing to mention about the Q300L are its external dimensions, always important for a PC case which may sit just about anywhere in your home or office. This case is quite short at only 387mm tall, a good deal shorter than true mid-towers, which you might expect to approach half a metre. It is however wide at 230mm, accommodating 140mm fans in 2 locations and supporting ATX power supplies. And finally, it is 378mm deep from front to back. Its footprint therefore isn't as long as most mid-towers, but is nonetheless relatively wide. Included with the retail model is a single black 3-pin 120mm fan. You'll likely need to budget for a couple of extra if the system you intend to build is a toasty one. Anyway, on to a closer look. Some will love and some will hate the striking geometric pattern on the front of the Q300L, but either way it's rare to see restrained aesthetic elements on quality cases in this price range. And that's certainly an unexpected feature. The entire front is in fact one large dust filter, held in place magnetically to the chassis. As you can see, it's easy to remove and clean as necessary. The front air intake can accommodate 2 120 or 140mm fans, and also allows you to fit a single radiator up to 240mm. In another twist to this case's design, Cooler Master have seen fit to install I/O into the side panel rather than the front. Thanks to a clever side panel and frame design, it's also possible to change the case edge this I/O panel will sit on, to the top or bottom as desired. The panel incorporates 2 USB 3.0 ports, a power button, headphone and microphone jacks, and a reset button, as well as an activity LED. Slightly restrictive access means that you'll ideally have the case sitting on top of a desk rather than underneath or alongside it. To do otherwise would make it very easy to clip or damage anything plugged in. As with the front, the top is overlaid with one large dust filter onto which the geometric pattern is printed. The top will only accommodate 2 120mm fans. Unfortunately, due to the mounting point placement and cramped internals, you won't be able to fit a radiator in this position. The side panel is a single transparent square of plastic held in place by 4 screws, rather than a more common metal framed window that slides into place. Screws are rubberized, so you shouldn't be in danger of damaging the window when tightening. This design is likely a hangover of other MasterBox cases based on a similar template, being fitted with a tempered glass side panel. But it also makes that movable I/O panel feature possible. On the reverse we have a similar side panel mounting system, but this time with a single steel sheet. As the screws are rubber, it's possible to lay the case horizontally and not damage the desk surface when installing components, which is a nice touch. And with side panels removed, here is how an installed system looks. We've used a standard size MATX motherboard and performance GPU, and there's no obvious space issues at first glance. Of course, it's also possible to use an ITX motherboard. At a glance, there's nothing surprising to see internally. Plenty of space, with no drive cages or ancillary components around to obstruct airflow. In many respects, it looks like a mid-tier case with the bells and whistles stripped out, and that's by no means a criticism. The power supply is mounted in a standard position on the floor of the case, sitting on rubber mounts that will absorb vibration. Length restrictions are minor and more of a nod to neat cable management. In this configuration, air is typically drawn through from below. We should note that removing and cleaning the floor filter does require that the case be placed on its side. One thing we're not a fan of are the rear PCI slot covers, which use the cheaper metal pushouts rather than replaceable covers. Care needs to be taken when you remove each, as it's possible to leave sharp edges or slightly warp the metal. You'll have 4 slots available, letting you install up to 2 dual slot graphics cards. The case comes with one 120mm fan pre-installed in the rear. 2 similar fans may be installed in the top. Fan mount positioning means that 240mm radiators aren't supported, but even if they technically were, you would have trouble clearing the top of the motherboard. Farewell optical drives, you are no longer welcome. Joining an industry trend, Cooler Master has dispensed with the typical drive cage, opting instead for 2 fixed mounting points for 2.5-inch hard drives or SSDs. Pads acoustically isolate the drive from the chassis, reducing the amount of noise a mechanical drive would generate. Plus, convenient cable management holes should let you make it look quite attractive. Cooler Master have not dispensed with 3.5-inch mechanical drive support. In yet another twist, however, the mount point is behind the motherboard tray and via a bracket. You only get one though, so use it wisely. These slightly restrictive storage options mean that the Q300L is less well suited to a home file server role than a more general home desktop use case. CPU cooler clearance is a critical issue for size-restricted chassis, but Cooler Master has listed the Q300Ls as a relatively roomy 157mm. Here we have installed the tall Noctua NH-U12S complete with Coromax cover. At 160mm tall, this actually exceeds the 157mm clearance and just touches the side panel window. Although it technically fits, we in general would stick to Cooler Master's advisory. Also, we should mention the I/O panel. Installation at the top could have an impact on maximum cooler clearance, and particularly wide coolers may pose a problem. If in doubt, install the I/O panel in the right rather than top position. And just in case it wasn't clear enough, there's plenty of space for long GPUs. We measure a maximum allowable length of 360mm, which would be reduced by the installation of fans and radiators. Our Aorus RX 570 didn't even come close to maxing out the space available. In most aspects, the Q300L's cable management options are very good, especially for a case in this price bracket. The motherboard tray has plenty of convenient holes for cable pass-through, including one next to the front of the PSU for an 8-pin CPU power cable, and its counterpart at the top. None of the holes are grommeted, clearly in a nod to keeping costs down. Cooler Master have been generous in allowing a 2.5cm gap between the motherboard tray and side panel, clearly in part to make room for a mechanical hard drive. This greatly eases the challenge of cable management, both in terms of routing and tucking away excess. The rear of the motherboard tray also has about 10 standoffs for cable ties, making organised routing of cables very simple. Hiding cables, today perhaps the primary purpose of cable management, should be almost trivial in this chassis. And that's our look at Cooler Master's MasterBox Q300L. There's quite a lot to unpack, so let's summarise. For a budget PC case, remember it comes in at only £40, is pretty well appointed. Clearly, Cooler Master have developed a frame that works well and can be retrofitted to many different models, and seems particularly well tailored to the budget market. Cable management is great, and shows none of the penny pinching you often associate in the budget market, as if buying a cheap case meant that users didn't deserve an attractive system that's easy to assemble. The full cover dust filter is an especially innovative approach that adds aesthetic flair alongside practicality. The geometric design is attractive to our eye, and is probably better than the plain alternative. We would like to have seen some sort of raised border on the case around the filter to seat it more securely, but perhaps that's just nitpicking. There might also even be scope for a bit of simple modding if you're willing to break out the spray paint, or Cooler Master themselves could add dust filters with alternate image designs to their web store. Thanks to side panel screws acting as feet in a pinch, component installation is also extremely easy. Of course, there are a couple of downsides. The I/O panel on the side is really one innovation we could have happily lived without. There's a reason why placing the I/O at the front of the chassis is the most common solution on the market. Cooler Master's implementation is neat and flexible, but means that ideally a case would sit on the top of a desk and on the right hand side for the sake of access. Only shipping with one fan will mean that high performance systems will incur an additional cost for one or two more. That's an extra £10 or £20, but does mean that you can get exactly what you want in terms of noise and lighting. Restricted support for water cooling may generate a lot of discussion, but problems will probably be overblown. Just supporting one 240mm radiator is more than many will expect at this price. And if you have more than one, then for Pete's sake push the boat out and buy a more expensive case. That aside, one other annoyance are those push-out PCI slots. Yes, it's cheaper that way, but also introduces hiccups in the build process that aren't really warranted. Would advise you to push them all out when first installing the system, and then get some blanking plates or use the PCI Express slot USB port adapters that often come with your motherboard. Dealing with them when a motherboard is installed can be a real headache, and it's too easy to scratch the board if you're not being very careful. So all in all, Cooler Master's MasterBox Q300L is an amazing value micro ATX case at a cracking price point for a budget build. It looks great, it's well built, and incorporates modern features you expect from more expensive mid-range designs. Our thanks to Cooler Master for the review sample. A link to our written review can be found in the description as usual, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.